Good afternoon, everybody. Today, for the New Agent Mastermind, I wanted to go over the addendum to purchase agreement sale of buyer's property contingency. We talked a little bit about a little bit. We had multiple classes about the purchase agreement itself, and now I wanted to go into some of the addendums, and some more information about things that you should just know and how these things work. So here is the addendum to purchase agreement sale of buyer's property. Now, if you're attaching to this to the purchase agreement, don't forget in the purchase agreement, you need to make sure that it's contingent on this and that the addendum is added to the purchase agreement. Okay. Your first date right here on line one is a reference date. It's the date you're putting together the contract. Normally, this will be the date that you are writing the purchase agreement. Okay. Sometimes you do end up writing a purchase agreement, but you're in the middle of negotiations, and then the buyer wants to add this contingency. That's okay, but then this date will be different. But that's not normally how it happens. 95% of the time, you're putting this with the purchase agreement when you first submit to the listing agent. Now, we're going to line two, which just says page one. You don't need to worry about that. Line three talks about this is that an addendum to the purchase agreement dated blank. Please remember that date that you're going to put in there is on line one of the purchase agreement. It's that reference date of the purchase agreement. Okay. Pertaining to the purchase and sale of the property at whatever address you're doing, which property. Uh, there we go. Which property your buyers, there we go. Which property your buyers are buying, right? I have a fly in here. I'm so sorry. Um, And so that's where this piece goes. Most of the time, this information is already going to be in transaction desk or transact. And so these pieces will pull over automatically. Always make sure that it's correct. The system can sometimes make mistakes. Nobody's perfect, including computers. Then it goes on to 6 and 7. This purchase agreement is contingent upon buyer entering into a valid purchase agreement for the sale of the buyer's property located at, when you put the buyer's property address, right? Which property they have to sell to be able to buy this one. Okay. Then it goes on to tell the seller and the listing agent about what status that buyer's property is currently in. So it says buyer's property either is currently listed or will be listed within blank days with somebody. Now, sometimes, so if it is currently listed, then you would put who has the listing right now. So if it's with us, you would put Coldwell Banker, Crown Realtors. If it's maybe someplace out of town, right? Maybe it's Coldwell Banker River Valley, in the southern part of the state, right? Whatever broker, whatever company has listed the property, that's what you put in line nine. Okay. So that's currently listed. Then if we do will be listed within X amount of days, this amount of days varies widely. So sometimes it's 3 days, sometimes it's 15. It just depends on how soon your buyers can get their property on the market and ready to go with whoever they're listing with. Okay. Um, Sometimes the buyers don't expect the perfect property to come up right now. And so they might need 15 days to get their property ready because they weren't planning on selling, but they have been watching this one house forever and always, and they just want that house so bad, right? And so then maybe you put in 15 days and you do the best that you can to make sure they get their property on the market. Most of the time, however, I'd probably say 70% of the time, this is about 3 to 5 days. Okay. Now, remember, don't put a range in here, put an actual day amount. But usually it's within 3 or 5 days. Okay. Then it says on line 10 that the seller shall have the right to continue to offer the property for sale until this contingency is removed. This means that on the MLS, for buyers agents, let your buyers know that the property will still be active. They will still allow showings. They'll still be able to negotiate with other buyers, and possibly the seller will accept an offer from another buyer while our first buyer is trying to sell their home. Okay. On the listing agent side of this, that means that the property will still stay active on the MLS. So when you go to change the status, you'll leave the active status alone. And on the contingency status, you say subject to buyer's property sale. You have to do that as a listing agent, and please let your sellers know this. We are required through our association to market a property correctly. If we have an accepted offer, we can still keep property on the market. We can still show it. We can still accept other offers, but we have to tell everybody that we have an offer that's accepted, but it's contingent on the sale of the buyer's property. Okay. Now, this goes on to say 11 to 13 talks about the seller's right to demand the removal of this contingency. Some sellers will get tired of waiting for the buyer's property to close. And so they'll just want to move on with their life and either cancel the purchase agreement or get another purchase agreement. They want to take that one. The seller has the right to demand the removal of this contingency at any time. Please pay attention to that. The seller does not need to have an offer on the table to be able to ask for removal of this contingency. They can remove it or ask for the removal at any time. Okay. Then it goes on to say how they can demand that removal. To demand a removal of this contingency, seller or licensee representing or assisting seller shall deliver to buyer or licensee representing or assisting buyer written notice demanding removal of this contingency. Okay. I always recommend that these removals are signed by the seller, or the requests are signed by the seller. So you might want to send out an addendum, maybe just on a letterhead, saying, hey, we need this removed, or we're going to move on. We're going to cancel. Okay. You can also do it by text message. You can also do it by email. However, it does say written notice, and it holds a little more weight if the seller's signature is on there. Okay. Now, once that removal demand is given to the buyer, what can the buyer do? Right? Here's the deal with this addendum. And a lot of people get this wrong. In this addendum, if you use it, when you use it, the only way that your buyer can remove this contingency legally per the contract terms is by giving a true and valid signed purchase agreement for the sale of the buyer's property to the seller. That's it. The buyer can't go get a bridge loan and then go back to the seller and say, okay, it's removed. The seller doesn't have to accept that. That's not what's been agreed to here. Okay. Now, in real life, if the seller can go ahead and sell the property, are they going to do it? Probably, right? In real life, the buyer and seller can amend the purchase agreement, can agree to different terms, and be able to remove this contingency and move ahead to closing. They absolutely can. But just so you know, the only time a seller has to agree to the removal of this contingency is if the buyer has a valid, fully signed purchase agreement on their home. Okay. Now, I'll go into this a little more. So, buyer removal of contingency, that's exactly what this says. To remove this contingency, buyer or licensee representing or assisting the buyer shall deliver to the seller or licensee representing or assisting the seller, that's you guys as the agent, at any time, but not later than X amount of calendar days of receipt of a written notice from seller, a true copy of a valid, fully signed purchase agreement for the sale of buyer's property that is not contingent upon anything other than financing, and that has a closing date not later than the closing date in this purchase agreement. If buyer enters into a valid purchase agreement for the sale of buyer's property as defined here, buyer shall remove this contingency as specified in this addendum. Buyer shall have until 11:59 p.m. on the final calendar day referred to on line 15 to remove this contingency. Now, that was a lot of words, right? What does that mean? What that means is if the seller goes to the buyer and says, "All right, I'm ready for you to remove your contingency here. You need to poop or get off the pot, right? I need you to remove this contingency and move ahead with buying my property, or we need to cancel this purchase agreement." The buyer has a certain amount of calendar days to be able to do that. Okay. So once that notice is given from the seller demanding removal of this contingency, then the buyer has however many days you put in here as the buyer's agent, has that many days to come up with a valid, fully signed purchase agreement contingent on nothing except financing. Okay. Now, with this, how many days should you put in here? That's the question that I get all the time. How long should you give your buyer to be able to remove this contingency? My recommendation is usually 5 days. If I'm on the buyer side, 5 days, because keep in mind, these are calendar days. So if they need to go to their bank and do something different, maybe pull out a home equity loan and just move forward, granted, keep in mind what I said before, that becomes an amendment to the purchase agreement completely. Okay. But I usually put 5 days. They've got 5 days to get that fully signed purchase agreement to the seller. If, and that's calendar days. So we're counting weekends here, weekends and holidays. If you're on the seller side, if you're the listing agent, you want these number of days to be as small as possible. If your seller wants to move on to the next offer because it's higher, it has better options, it doesn't have an inspection, whatever, then you want these calendar days to be as low as possible. That's why it's a blank. That's why it's a negotiating piece of the purchase agreement. Maybe both buyer and seller don't care. And they really want, buyer really wants this particular house and the seller really wants this particular buyer to buy the house. So maybe you put 30 days in there. Maybe you put 15, right? The amount of calendar days that you put in here really depends on what the situation is between the buyer and the seller. And like I said, it's a negotiating piece. So you might get counters back and forth, changing this amount of days a couple times so that it works for everybody. But for a rule of thumb, anywhere between 3 and 7 calendar days is fairly normal for this particular contingency. Okay. Now remember, big asterisk. Okay. To remove this contingency, the buyer can only do it by giving a purchase agreement for the sale of their property fully executed that is contingent on nothing but financing and has a closing date not later than the closing date of this purchase agreement that we've got in there. Okay. If they don't have those things, the seller can refuse to allow the buyer to remove this contingency and they can go with that other offer anyway. Okay. Now, again, are sellers going to do that? Probably not, unless the other offer is really, really, really good, but probably not. Okay. Let's go on to the rest of this, and we're almost done. 21 to 26 talks about the closing of the buyer's property. So how the buyer removes this contingency is they deliver a fully executed purchase agreement to the listing agent or the seller. Okay. And then purchase this offer that they've put in becomes contingent on the successful closing of the buyer's property. That's what this says. If buyer removes this contingency for the sale of buyer's property, this purchase agreement becomes contingent upon successful closing on the buyer's property. If buyer's property does not close on or before the closing date in this purchase agreement is canceled. Buyer and seller shall immediately sign a cancellation of purchase agreement, confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money paid here to be refunded to buyer. The language in this paragraph supersedes any other provision to the contrary in any financing contingency made a part of this purchase agreement, if any. So, buyer's house is under contract. You're really good. You've given the fully executed purchase agreement to the listing agent, and then the buyer's buyer falls apart. Their financing doesn't happen. They have to extend because they're waiting for some documents to come in for the bank, right? Something happens. If the buyer and seller do not agree to extend the closing date, this purchase agreement is canceled. So when you're doing these, we call them dominoes, right? Where it's a buyer that has to sell their home to buy this one, and that seller has to sell their home to buy the next one, and then that one has to sell their home to buy the next one, right? These are dominoes. And so if the first buyer has an issue, you got to work with everybody in the domino to make sure that these closing dates match, to make sure that nobody's outside of their contractual terms that they've agreed to. Okay. Then it goes on to say the language in this paragraph supersedes any other provision in any financing contingency. If you remember way back from when we were talking about the purchase agreements, there was that written statement option of the financing contingency that we could have, right? Where we would tell the buyer, I'm sorry, we as the buyer would tell the seller, hey, Mr. Seller, I'm really confident about my financing. If I do not get financing by this date, then you can have my earnest money or we'll cancel this purchase agreement. Okay. If in that financing contingency, the buyer has said that the seller can retain the earnest money because they've failed to get financing, but then the buyer's property doesn't close, okay, then the buyer gets their earnest money back because of this piece. Little confusing. You probably won't have to deal with it all that much, but this is a part of that. All right. Then it goes on to failure to remove contingency. If seller demands removal, remember they can demand that at any time, and buyer does not timely remove this contingency, this purchase agreement is canceled. Buyer and seller shall immediately sign a cancellation of purchase agreement confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money paid here to be refunded to buyer. This is just legal terms that's saying if the buyer does nothing, when the seller asks for removal, the seller can move forward with going ahead and canceling. Okay. Then it goes on to say if neither party timely removes this contingency and this purchase agreement does not close on or before the closing date specified, this purchase agreement is canceled. So nobody does anything. And we get all the way to the closing date, which is why you can't have a closing date as TBD. Do not do TBD. Do it 6 months out. Go ahead and put the closing date 6 months out, but do not put TBD. If nobody does anything, then the buyer and seller can cancel this purchase agreement and it shall be canceled and all the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. Okay. This then goes on to say, in the event there is more than one buyer or seller, the parties agree that any one buyer may remove the contingency as specified here, and any one seller may demand removal of this contingency. So if you have a husband and wife situation, say on the selling side, on the listing side, and the wife wants to demand the removal of this contingency and the husband doesn't, legally, it says right here, one of them can demand it, and that demand removal becomes active. Okay. Same thing on the buyer side. Okay. Okay. Your buyer and seller will sign this at the bottom right there and put in some dates, and you're good to go. That's the sale of buyer's property contingency. If you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll talk to you later.